Hello, Phantom Fables followers. We continue our stories from where we left off. I hope you like it. Summer vacation had finally arrived, and for me it was one of the most eagerly anticipated moments in years. My friends and I were ready for the camping adventure we had planned for a long time. We met up at an isolated campsite deep in the heart of a secluded forest. No one had camped in this area for a long time, so we were going to be in the midst of untamed wilderness. Our first day was sunny, and everything looked perfect. We lit our campfire, set up our tents, and enjoyed the beauty of nature. However, the first night heralded a time very different from the day. As darkness fell, the silence of the forest became eerie. The wind picked up, and strange, ominous shadows began to dance on the trees. My friends and I tried to pass the time by telling stories and joking, but our inner unease was growing. That night, I lay awake in my tent. I began to hear strange sounds outside. At first, I thought these sounds might be caused by the wind or animals, but everything grew stranger. Whispers and rustling seemed to be circling around my tent. Eventually, my curiosity became unbearable, and I decided to go outside. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly exited my tent. In the darkness of the forest, I saw a bizarre figure. The figure resembled a strange creature with long legs and long arms. Its eyes glowed, and the sight froze me in place. Suddenly, the figure started approaching me. Its steps were silent, but its breathing echoed. I recoiled in fear and aimed my flashlight at the figure. In the light, I saw its horrifying face. It was pallid and appeared partially decayed. I let out a scream and ran back to my tent, waking up my friends. When they too saw the creature I had witnessed, everyone was in a panic. We hastily packed our belongings and began to flee the campsite along the path that led deeper into the forest. But the creature was following us. After a while, we made it out of the forest and quickly drove away in our car. The deep silence and darkness of the campsite we left behind still haunted my mind. We were sure that something we couldn't explain was lurking in the forest. We never returned to that old campsite again. The terrifying night we experienced became a part of all our lives. None of us could explain what the creature was or why it attacked us. But the fear we lived through that night remains an unforgettable memory for each of us. And I can't help but wonder what kind of dreadful secrets are hidden in the depths of that dark forest. In the dark forest, a quiet camp was filled with rustling leaves and crackling branches. 5 old friends had embarked on a weekend getaway into nature's heart. However, the end of this escape would turn into a horrifying mystery. As the campfire crackled on this silent night where the wind whispered faintly, the friends laughed and chatted. But as the night grew, they noticed something odd about the atmosphere. The wind suddenly ceased, and the forest fell silent. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. 4 friends were unaware of the terrible thing that was about to happen. But the 5th one, young and timid Sarah, had a feeling that something was amiss. Her face pale, she nervously spoke up. "I have a bad feeling, guys." The others dismissed her. "It's just a dark and quiet forest, Sarah. Don't worry." However, Sarah's unease intensified, and that night, instead of falling asleep in her tent, She kept her eyes wide open and watched. As the hours passed, the silence of the forest grew even deeper. Then, suddenly, a strange murmur was heard in the distance. Sarah immediately called out to her friends, but they were still joking around, pretending not to hear the murmur. Sarah's heart sank, but the murmur was getting closer. She quickly returned to her tent and felt a cold gust of wind that made her hair stand on end due to the drop in temperature. And then she saw the source of the murmur. In fear, her eyes focused on a dark figure emerging from the forest, a tall and slender shadow closing in on her surroundings. Sarah screamed and ran towards her friends, but the figure was fast approaching, and in an instant, it vanished before her eyes. The others rushed outside in response to Sarah's screams, but they saw nothing. Sarah's heart was still racing, and they spent the night sleepless. When morning came, the silence of the forest had returned to normal. However, Sarah was no longer there. She had left only her tent and personal belongings at the campsite. Her friends ventured into the forest to search for her, but found no trace. Sarah had mysteriously disappeared into the dark forest, and there were no clues about what had happened to her. From that day on, no one ever went back to that campsite. Sarah's mysterious disappearance felt like a lingering curse. The group of friends still felt a shiver recounting that night's events. Sarah's mysterious death and vanishing haunted them forever.